And when we're on a burning platform, we go into survival mode. Yeah. And what does that do? It stops the relationships. It actually makes us disconnected from other people because we're too busy trying to survive on our own. It makes us not very creative. We're trying to do urgent things that will keep us alive for another 24 hours or a week. And we're not really trying to establish our business.
Hello again, I'm Joe Espana, your host for GOBO, where we avoid the guru speak and focus on the stuff that's glaringly obvious but somehow slips through the cracks. It's like missing your reading glasses when they're sitting on the top of your head. I've done that several times. Now, those of you who know me know that I have a real interest in what makes high-performing teams tick. What does it really take to get a team working at its absolute best? So I thought I would get my friend and colleague Richard Hurd on the case with me. With many years' experience of organizational effectiveness with blue chip businesses, I thought he would be perfect to chat to about high-performing teams. What does optimum even mean when you've got different personalities, goals, and challenges? We had these and many other ideas to chew over, and we had several elements to consider. So, let's unpack it together. How are you, Richard? It's great to see you.
Yeah, you too, Joe.
I'm really delighted to have this conversation with you because you and I have both been working as teams for quite a while. And one of the questions I've always had in the back of my mind is why is it that sometimes teams plateau or they haven't got all the gearing oiled properly to actually perform at the level the organization needs, or the performance level that is expected of them, or they just haven't really got trucking enough. So this is what I'd like to explore with you today, if that's okay. And I think a good place to start would be, let's get our arms around a definition. So teams, how are we going to describe teams?
Well, I tend to like the Kassenbach and Smith definition. It's a group with complementary skills and experience with a unified purpose. They distinguish between groups we commonly call teams because they've got a common reporting line or have a good social interaction, a positive collaborative spirit, from those who are a discrete unit of production. In other words, they produce some collective output or result.
Yeah.
Those two bits sit well with me. I've been able to use those fairly effectively the past 10, 20 years or so to help groups think about what sort of team they need to be.
Sometimes organization design doesn't help us. What people focus on is the org chart, whatever it might be. It could be matrixed, or it could be our traditional hierarchy. It doesn't really matter. But the sheer fact that on a piece of paper somewhere, a number of people have been grouped together, they then all of a sudden get labeled team.
Yeah.
When you deconstruct Katzenbach's and Smith's definition, there's a key element here of a common purpose. I want to explore that further with you, because when I've discussed this notion of a common purpose, particularly with senior teams, maybe less so with teams further into the organization, this notion of you're a team because you've got a common purpose. Another problem or mental model arises, which is what we do is our purpose. And that's not the case at all in terms of what we're describing. So purpose is a key component, isn't it? They've got common goals, if you mentioned. The other one I think is to do with process, which is that they've agreed how they might work together in order to produce whatever it is they've got to produce collectively. And the other one, which is probably more to do with the nature of psychological safety that might exist in the team, they hold each other mutually accountable for all of these things. So for their agreed purpose, for their common goals, performance goals, for their approach they're going to take to deliver all of this stuff, they're not waiting for the team leader to hold them accountable. They do it together. I think that's quite important. It's almost like various ingredients that make up a team that performs, as opposed to a a project group or some other, as I think Katzenbach talked about pseudo teams, don't they?
They talk about pseudo teams and working groups. They talk
That's right.
about working group as a legitimate alternative to real team,
Yeah.
which I think is an important distinction, because there are a lot of groups under the illusion that they should be a team, and they would be better served operating as a working group. That is, with individual accountabilities that maybe collectively add up to fulfillment of a common purpose, but they don't. They ostensibly do this individually, separately, independently. Sometimes they are under the illusion that they should become a team and take on all the mannerisms and become a pseudo team, which is clearly not a legitimate alternative to either a real team or a working group. But I think one of the things, Joe, you summarise the characteristics really well, is this thing about the confusion that exists, whether it's from the org chart, our expectations, like just the mere fact that most people like being in a team. It's seen as potentially positive if it's a functional team. So they aspire to it almost irrespective of whether their performance requirement needs it.
You've raised loads of stuff there. This thing of the as human beings wanting to be part of a team, this sense of this feeling of belonging. It's sort of like, I don't know, if I went back to cave days, the tribe. I'm part of this tribe. But I think going back to the definition that we're trying to put our arms around, this thing of purpose has to be central, because the title, the organizational title we give to a group of people in a team is not the same as their purpose. Their purpose is about why they exist. Before we get there, the other thing that I think Katzenbach and Smith talk about that we haven't said anything about yet is how many should be, is there an optimum number for a highly effective, high-performing team? The authors do have a particular view about this. They talk about there being a small number. When I'm working with teams, I'm sure you do the same. I show them the definition, and then I go, okay, what's a small number? What's in your context, what would be a really good number? Have you come across that before?
Yeah, I have. I've also, Joe, I don't know if you have too. I'm struggling to recall the source of it, but in addition to Katzenbach and Smith, I've read stuff. I think it was the Oxford Review published a meta analysis of the effectiveness of teams and team building a few years ago. They had the same premise, that it needed to be a small number because the lines of communication exponentially increase, and beyond a certain number, whether it's 6, 8, 10, 12, whatever it is, it becomes almost impossible. And observations about society and how, what was the largest functioning team in society ever? And even that evidence is not normally above about 150, because you have to feel people and communicate directly and have some rapport and opportunity to collaborate. Otherwise, it can't be a team. They produced some conflicting data that suggested it was relative to the relationships. So teams that consider themselves friends, even though friendship is normally, we normally separate that from the more analytical thought about team building, then their numbers can increase significantly without detrimental impact. So it's made me think. So I use that small statement like you do, and I get people thinking about getting the team to an optimum size, not just loading it with every representative that they can think of, but it's proportionate, it's relative. The functionality of the team is relative to the relationships of the people within it.
The notion of teamwork and maybe high-performing teamwork, that's the phrase that everybody talks about nowadays, isn't it? High performance or high-performing teams is wanted. And by the way, one other quote that came to mind, and I looked it up because I thought, I'm sure this is wrong. You know that phrase of the sum of the parts, Aristotle? Is totally misquoted. It's quoted as the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's how it tends to be quoted. And actually, Aristotle didn't say that. What he actually said was the whole is something besides the sum of its parts. And what happened was that there was a mathematician, a Greek mathematician called Euclid, who then added as a mathematical equation that the whole is greater than the individual parts of the equation. And so those two phrases have been nicked by organizational development consultants and merged into you need teamwork because the sum of the parts produces more than the contribution of individuals. The quote's not accurate. So I think there's a business case in there somewhere. Leaders or managers in organizations or businesses generally say we need teams that are constituted properly and highly, operating on all four cylinders and producing what this business produced. And I think that's part of the background to why there is a focus on teams and team working in businesses.
I'm sometimes shocked at how underestimated the value of developing effective teams is. And secondly, by the understanding of how to develop them. But all of my experience suggests that whilst some organizations it's more critical than others, it's probably one of the most important opportunities for people like ourselves to add value to the organizations we serve, and for those organizations to add value to their own performance.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. It drives me bonkers the number of organizations, and I do think it's to do with organizational maturity. Where are they on that curve in terms of understanding some of this stuff? They lean towards higher levels of productivity, and they lean towards, in order to answer that, they lean towards team building, which is more about our social interaction, how we feel about being with one another, rather than team development. I think there's a lot of confusion out there between team building and team development. And I think that what we're saying, given the kind of definition that we subscribe to, team development is about increasing the performance output of a team over a period of time. I think Katzenbach talk about this, that this group of people who we've labeled as a team, if they're a real team, as we're defining it, one of two things need to exist. One is the expected or defined performance that this team must produce is needed by the organization, or there is an opportunity in terms of what the business is trying to achieve, perhaps, for them to produce that performance. So that's on one side of the fence. The other side of the fence is the contributions that individuals make by pulling all these ingredients together, as we've described in the definition, that over time their performance output or their effectiveness increases because they're constantly spinning all the various plates of the ingredients called an effective team. And I think that I've experienced that very often that's not thought about deeply enough in an organization. They kind of go, oh, we want this team to feel like we're really glued together and cohesive. And what we'll do is we'll go out to a stately home somewhere and do some it's a knockout type of exercises and team building stuff in the hope that that's going to be able to be translated back into our work context next week.
Yeah, I think it's sad, isn't it, really? Our industry has contributed to that, has fed that over decades, but I don't do it anymore. So there's some of that. There's a provision thing. It's what people think that they do. It's what they reach for. Most people have had experience of such stuff and have seen some benefits. At least it was enjoyable usually. They got to know each other better. They sometimes feel profoundly different towards each other. And this is all useful. I'm not trying to say that that isn't useful, but alone it will not make a great team. But conversely, one of Katzenbach and Smith's observations that I always find fascinating, but really true, that really resonates, is that some groups become really effective teams without any of it. Their conclusion, in a nutshell, is the performance requirement was so compelling, so urgent, so felt by everyone in the group that they come together. Some of the stuff that we try to do consciously with teams that we help develop, they just do. And I think you see this a lot. You see it in sport, you see it in business, But I think it's important to extract the lessons from it so that more groups can elevate their performance faster and more effectively. So I think what I try to do now in my practice is help them understand a methodology and a sequence of things that they can do to accelerate that journey and start delivering more collectively.
I think we've got very recent examples of where necessity has brought teams together, managing COVID, lockdown in particular, and having to do things quickly. Crises very often create sufficient need to pull people together. The example that's very often used is Houston, we've got a problem. And then all of a sudden, teams really got to get their finger out to work out how to get these people back safely. I definitely go with that notion of the need, the necessity, the context will be a driving force as well. I think the challenge for a lot of organizations is when that isn't necessarily the case. It's not the bridge that we often talk about, burning bridges, don't we? The bridge is not about to collapse, maybe on fire, maybe you can see some of the smoke, maybe there is a bit of a need, but your bottom isn't on fire just yet.
Joe, I know you're a big reader too, but we've learned, I think, particularly in recent times, about how burning platforms have a downside.
Yeah, definitely.
And the main, I think, thing that's informed our understanding of that is probably neuroscience and how we need to maintain our relationships and our creativity and our openness. And when we're on a burning platform, we go into survival mode. Yeah. And what does that do? It stops the relationships. It actually makes us disconnected from other people because we're too busy trying to survive on our own. It makes us not very creative. We're trying to do urgent things that will keep us alive for another 24 hours or a week. And we're not really trying to establish our business on a footing that will make it successful for the next 5-10 years. We're not doing that at all. In fact, we don't collaborate very effectively. We don't innovate. All of that starts to diminish as a result. I'm more in favor of groups that think there's something about them being a team, is getting them to define a compelling purpose, an exciting, aspirational, ambitious purpose that engages them. That has a totally different effect on us neurologically, psychologically, emotionally.
You make a terrific point about the negative side of crises. Crises neurologically will kick in what we've termed in the past as fight or flight mode, now more described as moving towards or moving away. Some people will have what's known as an amygdala hijack, where the emotional response to that crisis reduces their ability to rationally figure out what is it that I'm confronting together with my colleagues and how should we tackle this in an appropriate way that gets us past the crisis, etc.
Did you know the Oxford Review report that I referred to earlier? They called it self-efficacy, and it was essentially a team's confidence in its own ability to do what it needed to do.
Yeah.
And this is linked to neuroscience, I think. The feeling in the group that we collectively could fulfill our purpose and that every individual would play their part and be satisfied with their contribution, that they were good enough to do it. That didn't mean they weren't going to develop or learn or grow. It just meant they had the motivation and the aptitude to fulfill it. The point you make there about not alerting the more primitive parts of our brain unnecessarily. If you've got a short-term crisis, by all means, do it. If the ship is really sinking and you've got to get on those lifeboats in 15 minutes, then you need to alert it a little bit. Otherwise, people aren't urgent. But in business, that is seldom what is required. If you think about most jobs.
There's a couple of things you've raised. You probably know that I'm heavily into and have been for some years now, the whole notion of the emotional climate that exists in a team and how questions like, what emotions does the success of this team depend on? How I feel about working here with these people has a significant influence on all sorts of things, sort of relationships, creativity, engagement, commitment, productivity. So I'm really into thinking about the emotional climate that might exist in a team. But something you said really starts getting team leaders to think about how to corral the collective contribution of team members. Because what you said was that there was a recognition, probably expressed by the review, that every individual faced with that situation was going to play their part. And what occurred to me as you were saying this, that I think there's three elements here in making that happen, that every individual play their part. I think there's the notion of I've got what it takes to play my part. I'm confident that I can play my part, and I want to. So the whole notion of being motivated enough, those three things are maybe not explored enough in teams, in organizations. If you start asking the question, why is it that some teams are not rocking and rolling at their optimum level, if you like? And I think stuff like the nature of the relationships that exist, and we talk about interpersonal trust, we talk about psychological safety, it feels like to be here. I think the other one that you and I may have spoken about before is that sometimes not all team members feel equal to each other. That kind of perception of where do I sit in relation to the members that maybe have been here a bit longer than me, or maybe know more about the business than me, that influences the ability of the gears to operate in a really smooth, oiled way. I think there's another aspect around, and maybe this is possibly influenced by the team lead, I've seen it sometimes, is that because of that maybe the reduced psychological safety, they get into yes mode too quickly and their conversations aren't robust enough. So they don't dig deep for creative ideas of problem solving or exploring a particular operational issue fully. And so they do it to a certain level and become slaves to the meeting agenda. It's like tick, tick, tick. We've discussed all of this when maybe at item 3, they really had to discuss, maybe not come to a conclusion just yet. I think that's another factor that maybe exists in teams. I mentioned the membership thing. Am I allowed to be a member of this team in my head kind of thing?
Sometimes the meeting agenda, their approach or the lack of a collaborative approach, because they've got meeting agenda, someone presents, others give a bit of feedback at the end, move on to next item very quickly. That does not encourage genuine collaboration. If that's how most of your meetings as a team look like, you're not going to get significant collaboration. It's compounded by every individual's psychology. Someone might arrive in that group at a very different point in terms of their confidence to someone else. It might be hierarchical status, their personality, their dominance, or any manner of things, or how sophisticated, refined, experienced they seemed. But you've also got this group thing, which these days is typically called psychological safety, which operates in a particular group. And those three things together, how I feel individually, how the group climate is, and the processes that we follow, have a significant impact on the emotions you're talking about. They'll create new ones, they'll compound negative ones people already have. If these three things are good, if you're building members' confidence, you start to create a psychologically safe space within the group where everyone's aware of that, and they respect it and contribute to it, and your processes allow for genuine challenge, dissent, discussion, creativity, off-the-wall ideas that may seem incredibly impractical, but someone's got a hunch there's something in it. If all that stuff is happening, then I think all of that starts to change, whichever order you do it in. It's more for me about the compound impact of those three things. You're building the confidence, creating a psychological safe space for the group, and you've got interventions that mirror the way that the group needs to function, not dictate it in another way that's dysfunctional or detrimental to teamwork.
Yeah, I love the phrase, the compound contribution. So that's taking us down the route of collectively, we're greater than the sum of our individual bits. If I could illustrate something you've just raised in my mind, I remember years ago, this is a real light bulb moment for me as the consultant. I was talking with a senior team and they said, we'd like to invite you to observe maybe half a dozen of our team meetings. I only got to number 3 and I knew exactly one of the process issues that wasn't helping them. What happens was, and I thought this must be happening elsewhere, where a senior team would get together. So they're in a meeting room, and what was happening was that they were going round the room, each reporting out on, I don't know, KPIs or some performance stuff that was really focused on their area of accountability. I was just observing this and I thought, while this person is reporting out really in a one-to-one conversation with the team leader, nobody else is listening. They're just waiting for their turn to then report out their bit to the team leader. So there was the absence of collective conversation around really important team productivity or team output, team results stuff, where everybody was involved in the conversation. It was a one-to-one conversation held in a group format. I thought that was interesting as a very specific intervention. The team leader could have, created, in the end we did. We created a different process whereby report outs were done outside of those meetings. The conversation in the room was about everybody using their collective brain power in discussing deeply a particular subject area. And the meetings were fundamentally transformed just by that one thing.
It doesn't surprise me. Your example resonates really strongly. I think it's one of the most common approach mistakes.
Yeah.
And I try to get the clients to think much more fundamentally about what they're trying to achieve together. So if I ask the question when they follow a process like the one you've just highlighted, does this process help you fulfill your purpose collaboratively? And the answer unanimously is no.
Yeah.
Then I say, what process do you need to adopt that would help you collaboratively fulfill your purpose? It is diametrically opposed to it. So for example, instead of focusing purely on meetings, they think, what can we take out of the meetings so that the meetings are discussive, collaborative, where we're supporting and challenging, where we're coming up with alternative ideas, we're having discussion, exploring more deeply. That's where they get the value from. Particularly these days, they use technology in a way that wasn't available 10, 20 years ago to collaborate outside of meetings by updating and contributing to each other's progress in a very different way, so that when they get together, they are interacting, all of them, not 2 or 3 of them. And my experience is you have to give them permission to consider a very fundamental question, because if you don't, they won't do it. Because I watch stuff like that and I'd say to them, why are you allowing that to continue? And often it came back to your earlier point about hierarchy, convention. We are quite more compliant than we'd like to believe we are, particularly if there's hierarchy involved. And if that's what the leader has set up, often with their secretary, they'll follow it. And these are quite senior people. I've seen directors with huge responsibility following such a process. And then if I say to them, what value does the business and your team get from such a meeting weekly like that? It's zero. It's zero. And you have to give them that question. And then I think of it as part of a team development process. Such questions are legitimate. They expect them. They're standing back from their everyday. Now they can revisit that process in a much more meaningful way. But it has to be anchored in purpose. I think if you don't anchor it there, you end up with people refining existing meetings, that sort of stuff. They don't really leverage the opportunity fully. The moment you say, what process do you need to fulfill your purpose? And don't just think about meetings, think about all of your interactions with each other. They come up with something wholly different. And then, then they take off. They start, in my experience, making big leaps and bounds at that stage.
Yeah, it's what I call strategic speed. So in terms of the cumulative results, what they have is reduced time to value and increased value over time in terms of what the team as a whole is producing. I'm just going to finish off on just picking up on a couple of points you meant there, which from a process point of view, you mentioned this thing about, what's my contribution? How do we all contribute in order to to add to what the team as a whole is trying to produce. One of the things in terms of, how we go about doing this, I think there's two things that need to happen. One is a single intervention about how we're going to work together is not sufficient. Teams need a reference point that they come back to at intervals that seem appropriate to the team to just refresh their thinking about how are we doing around this. I'll give you an example. Um, your question about how is that fulfilling our purpose? Let's just refer back to our purpose one more time, and let's make sure we've still got it clear in our minds, and that enables us to answer the question: how is this activity fulfilling our purpose? But the other one, and I think this takes us back to where we started around Katzenbach, and where Katzenbach and Smith talk about teams having complementary skills. Well, I think there's two things that teams can refer back to again, just to refresh their memory. The first is let's just touch base again on what our skill, knowledge, background experience, contribution is. And having awareness of that is not enough. So we're going to say, how are we actually utilizing all these complementary skills in order to help us push forward with our performance or our output, whatever we're being measured on, and contributing to our purpose. And the other side is that, no team that I've ever worked with in the last 30 years is perfect 100%. So there's going to be elements of development need, weakness, if you want to call it that way. But knowing what weaknesses exist in the team in itself isn't enough. I think it's a really good reference point for a team to go, okay, so we know that we're not perfect, but how do we minimize the potentially negative impact of having these weaknesses or lacking certain skills or knowledge or experience? And those two things, the referring back and how we're doing against our purpose and how we're managing our contribution, the things we bring in terms of skills and the things that are missing, and how do we manage all of that, is a really great way. I think the interval has to be agreed by the team itself, rather than anybody like you and I coming on. So you've got to do this every week. I mean, it's not realistic. It's for the team to decide. But I think as a rhythm, as a process, as a way of working together, referring back on themselves is a really useful way of keeping that engine going and fueling the engine to be able to motor at the level that they need it to motor.
Katzenbach and Smith call it the discipline of teams.
Yeah.
It's not a singular intervention. It's not even of annual program. It's an iterative process, which they call a discipline. I can see why they refer to it. The more you get into it, the more you realize that's what it is. And it's very iterative. And I try to make that as simple as possible for my clients by saying, well, you first got to work out what your requirement is, then what type of team fulfills that requirement. Then you can look at your approach and then you get on with it and but you review. And of course, that's a very simplistic view of it, but it gets them into the process. But you are quite right, I think, in pointing out it's iterative. They have to keep revisiting all aspects of this because they're so interdependent. And if psychological safety isn't high, for example, for whatever reason, and it's a complex thing, then it's going to undermine whatever process they put in place. But if their process isn't right, it will affect the psychological safety. It will impose a discipline that's unhelpful, that particularly if they're a little hierarchical or short of time, it will inhibit people changing it. Yeah.
Richard, there are so many moving parts to our subject. I want to get my priorities straight and thank you very, very much for this conversation. I think there's loads of stuff there that we could build on. I think this notion of team effectiveness is a big, big engine to what organizations are trying to achieve. But then figuring out how do you make it happen maybe takes a little bit more digging into. So thanks ever so much for exploring it all with me.
Yeah, no, thanks, Joe. I enjoyed it a lot.
Well, that's another GOBO episode done and dusted. Hopefully, we didn't just waffle on and you picked up something useful about getting the team firing on all four cylinders. If you did, hit subscribe And maybe even drop a comment if you've got some team tips of your own. Or why not share this episode with someone who could do with a nudge in the right direction? Remember, we're all just trying to figure out what makes teams tick. Until next time, bye for now.